And welcome to our program, Public Employee Pensions, Is the Current System Sustainable? This is presented to you today by the Kennedy School's Rappaport Institute of Greater Boston and the Worcester Regional Research Bureau. And we're very pleased to be able to co-sponsor this with the Rappaport Institute. And welcome the folks from the east of here. My name is Roberta Schaefer, and I'm the president of the Research Bureau. We'd really like to express our gratitude to the Mass College of Pharmacy and Health Sciences for hosting today's event. And to greet us here today is Dennis Lyons, who's the vice president of Government and Professional Affairs at the college. Dennis?
Thank you, Roberta. Good morning, all, and welcome to MCPHS. Here in Worcester. For those of you who may not be familiar with us, we have been here since 2000. We have 19 Foster Street and this building, 25 Foster Street, which is a historic building in downtown Worcester. This was actually built in 1900, and the building, the piece that we're on now was added by the college back in 2004. And has been the home for our, we actually have about 150 students living underneath you here. So we're delighted to be in the city. We're delighted to be part of the Worcester Research Bureau and to be able to host you today. And certainly this program today is one that is of great importance. I know that certainly it is of some controversy around not only the state but the nation. Personally, I'm a product of a state pension plan. My dad was a fireman in the city of Boston, died at 41, and he left a widow and 3 kids. So it's very personal to me to see, make sure that pensions for firefighters and police and teachers and other public officials and public servants continue, but clearly at a sustainable rate. So anyway, personally, I applaud the Research Bureau today for taking on this issue and providing a forum today to educate us all on the subject. So again, thank you. We're delighted to host, and we hope to be ongoing part of the Worcester Research Bureau. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. And it's a pleasure for us to be here in this wonderful facility. Today's program is part of the Research Bureau's Francis Harrington Forums on Municipal Government, and we are extremely grateful for our 2011 presenting sponsor, Commerce Bank, and our leadership sponsor, Bowditch & Dewey. Today's event sponsor is Polar Beverages, and we'd like to thank Ralph Crowley, Chris Crowley, and Mike Mulrain, and all the others from Polar who are here today. And you can see the Polar banner is back there. It is so large that we had to put it at the back for the moment, but it's certainly going to be on the screen, scanned in on the TV screen. Our other sponsors providing support, and there are many, are all listed on our annual meeting invitation, and you can see them all on our screen. We also want to express our appreciation to the Telegram and Gazette for advertising today's event and the City of Worcester Government Channel for videotaping it. And please be sure to visit the Research Bureau's website, wrb.org, where you can read and download all of our research reports as well as announcements of upcoming events and highlights of past events. And with the generous support of all our sponsors, we'll continue to offer these provocative programs free to the public. I'd also like to remind you, everyone, about our upcoming annual meeting, which will take place on Tuesday, May 31st at 4 p.m. at the DCU Center. And our featured speaker, I think as you probably all know, is Senator Scott Brown. Tickets are currently available, and we want to make you aware of that it will be held at the DCU, and a special thanks to the Center for hosting the event, and to Sandy Dunn, who's the general manager of the DCU and the current chairman of the Research Bureau. Thank you, Sandy. It's now my privilege to introduce the moderator for today's event, David Luberoff. David is the Executive Director of the Rappaport Institute for Greater Boston and has been in that position since June of 2004. Prior to that, he was the Associate Director for the Kennedy School's Taubman Center for State and Local Government and an adjunct lecturer at Harvard's Graduate School of Design. David is the co-author with Alan Altshuler of Mega Projects, The Changing Politics of Urban Public Investment, which was published by Brookings in 2003, and it was named that year's best book on urban politics by the American Political Science Association. He's also been a columnist on infrastructure issues for Governing magazine and co-editor of The Public's Capital, a quarterly forum on infrastructure policy, also published by Governing. He received his BA from Wesleyan University and an MPA from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Please join me in welcoming David Luberoff, the head of the Rappaport Institute. Thank you.
Thank you, Roberta, and thank you for letting the Institute focused on Greater Boston come out to Worcester, which may or may not be part of Greater Boston, depending on how we define it. As Roberta noted, my own work is often focused on infrastructure, and I've often described that as I got very interested about 25 years ago in the questions of how we dealt with things that were large, complicated, important, expensive, and for most people, most of the time, incredibly boring that they didn't pay attention to. I didn't include pensions in that, but pensions and related OPEB issues, the other benefits that we promise to public retirees, are clearly part of that lexicon. In fact, my boss and mentor, Ed Glazer, his wife, he says his wife, Nancy, has Nancy's rules, which is the four most boring words in the English language are unfunded pension liability. Notwithstanding that, I think increasingly four of the most important words for those of us interested, particularly in state and local government, are in fact the words unfunded pension liability. And we're here today to try and get our arms around that issue. And in particular, I think the question of can states, and particularly this state and its localities, particularly the localities in this region, honor their current pension commitments, and I think implicitly their current commitments around things like health insurance, without either substantially raising taxes, cutting services, or renegotiating the package of benefits for either current retirees or current employees. A pretty provocative and difficult question. Any of us who followed the news in the past weeks and months know that in many places this issue, rightly or wrongly, has been one of the great flashpoints in some of the most intense debates we've seen about the public sector, certainly in my lifetime. We're not Wisconsin or New Jersey, but we are, in fact, wrestling with the same issues. And I think one of the things that we're trying to do in Massachusetts is figure out how to wrestle with those in an honest and fair and reasonable and thoughtful way. And to that end, we've assembled, I think, a terrific panel today of experts. I'll briefly introduce each speaker as they come up. Our first speaker is J.P. Aubrey, who is Assistant Director of State and Local Research at Boston University Center for Retirement Research. For those of you who are not deeply immersed in this field, the Center for Retirement Research has really become one of, if not the premier source for information nationally about the magnitude of the state and local pension crisis and some of the options for dealing with it. To give you an idea of just how extensive they've been, if you go to JP's webpage, as I did last night, he is the co-author of, within the last year or so, the following reports: A Role for Defined Contribution Plans in the Public Sector, Can State and Local Pensions Muddle Through, the impact of pensions on state borrowing costs, the impact of public pensions on state and local budgets, and valuing liabilities in state and local plans. I hope you're going to get the movie rights to at least some of these. But seriously, these are terrific reports, really geared for we lay people who are interested in this. And so we asked JP to take about 10 to 15 minutes to sort of lay the groundwork for what the issue really kind of looks like, both nationally, but then to drill down a little bit for the state and for Worcester. JP will be followed by Jim Del Signore, who all of you know, has been the city's auditor for 20 years, has been chair of its retirement board for about 16, very active in the Government Finance Officers Association, really someone who knows this issue at a really kind of intimate level. And then batting cleanup, those of you who know Phil Puccia know that that is not Phil Puccia. Phil, unfortunately, was called away on business, but as he has ably done in the past, Steve Lasauskas, who was, in fact, Phil's successor as executive director of the Springfield Finance Control Board, agreed to pinch hit for Phil on very short notice, for which we are quite thankful. And Steve brings, I think, to the table an incredible amount of experience of what this issue looks like in lots of New England's older and financially and in many cases managerially challenged cities, both in direct experience and also both Stephen and Jim Del Signore, I think, can talk about how investors and bond rating agencies are really beginning to change, or we think are beginning to change the way they're thinking about this issue and what impact that's going to have on localities. So I think we've actually brought together a really remarkable group of people. Jim and Steve will both talk for about 10 minutes, and then we will open up for a little bit of a conversation among ourselves and then leave some time for questions and comments from the audience, which includes several people who are also quite expert in that. So with that, let me turn it over to JP, and again, to thank you and the Research Bureau for allowing us to be involved in this event. JP.
Good morning. I first off would like to thank the Worcester Research Bureau and David for organizing this event and allowing me to come here to speak to you about what has become a very important topic in the nation and here in Worcester. My task here is primarily to lay the groundwork or a framework for the questions that David brought up, and to paint a picture of the aggregate state and local arena, and the funding of state and local in aggregate, and also how it affects state budgets and borrowing costs. So let me get right to it and begin. First, how did we get here? Next, the impact of pensions on state and local budgets, the impact of pensions on borrowing costs, and finally, and probably most importantly, is areas for reform. When we first began, the Center first began research in state and local pensions, we never imagined that it would balloon to this magnitude. You can see right here what we have is the number of hits using terms state, local, crisis, and pension fund over the past decade or so. As you can see, the enormous spike in 2011 goes to show you that now everybody is concerned about this issue, and it's something that we need to address. We like to say at the center, financial crises are bad. If you had any assets in the past 2 years, you took a hit. Whether you were a endowment fund for university, an individual with a large amount of assets in an IRA, or any institutional investor, pensions were not exempt. As you can see, the funding ratio over time from 2001 to 2010, you can see a drop from 84 in 2008 to 77 now. These numbers are based on a database we've collected at the center of 126 state and local pension plans. Of course, that's not all the plans in the universe, but it does cover about 85% of the assets and about 90% of the members in the universe of state and local plans. Something that should be noted is that we expect to see the funding ratio to continue to drop because of actuarial smoothing methods that plans use, and they'll still be working through the 2008 and 2009 market losses as we go forward. So even as the market rebounds, we may see funding ratio still continue to decline. And unfunded liabilities are now about $800 billion, and we project them to increase maybe even to $1 trillion by 2013. And of course, there's the argument about the discount rate. Under the 8%, it's about $800 billion, as I just said. Under a more riskless rate, 4%, it's close to $3.5 trillion. Now, these numbers are large, but I think it should be said that liabilities don't need to be paid off tomorrow. They actually reflect a stream of smaller payments over time. The center just put out a brief that David mentioned, can state and local plans muddle through? And what we found is that plans still have enough under pessimistic assumptions to last about 20 to 30 years. So solvency is not an immediate issue for most pension plans. And recent media has linked dour pension finances to budget woes. And their claims are not without basis. The ARC has increased. You can see it's almost doubled in the past decade. And the increases are happening right as state and local tax revenues are dropping due to the recession. As you can see in 2010, state and local tax revenues began to increase, but however, we're still almost 3% below levels in 2007 in real terms. So these costs that I've mentioned are mostly attributable to state plans. Although the local plans are much more in number, they're much smaller in membership and assets. So you can see on the figure on the left that state plans make up only 9% of the total plans in the universe, yet they make up greater than 80% of assets, almost 90% of active members, and recently about 80% of contributions. Massachusetts is unique in the sense that it has many small local plans, or plans that are locally administered, as well as 2 major state plans. And you can see from the figure to the right, even though I'm focusing on state plans in this presentation, it does not mean that local plans are exempt from the pressures. For many of these state plans, a majority of contributions come from local governments. For example, Florida. The Florida retirement system gets 78% of its contributions from local governments. So state pension woes can affect local governments. So that's the scary talk. But on the whole, pensions currently make up a small portion of state and local budgets. As you can see on the left chart, over time, pension contributions have actually decreased. They used to be somewhere in the range of 5 to 7, and now they're right around 4. And on the bond front, pensions have similarly played a small role. In terms of the market interest rates from borrowing costs for for states, the pensions have generally had only a 3 basis point of impact on borrowing costs. And historically have had no impact on municipal bond ratings, surprisingly. But this picture may be changing. As David alluded to, we know that rating agencies are beginning to account for pension liabilities in their measurements. In January 2011, Moody's made a statement that it's combining its unfunded liabilities with other outstanding debt in its analysis. In February 2011, Standard & Poor's downgraded New Jersey from AA to AA-, specifically due to its pension problems. And many states have responded. The issue with a lot of the reform, not the issue, the challenge with a lot of the reform that states are undergoing is that for the most part, changes to benefits can only be applied to new hires. So it will take a long time for a lot of these plan design changes to work their way through the finances of the pension system. There are a few states that have attempted to make changes to current employees, notably, I believe it's Colorado, South Dakota, and Minnesota, I believe. And they tried to make changes to COLA, but those are being challenged in the courts. So it remains to be seen how those will play out. So the areas for reform, what can states and local pensions do? There are the oldies but goodies. Make your full arc. Historically, we found that in aggregate, the state and local sector was making about 80% of its annual required contribution. That needs to change. Another one is increasing the normal retirement age, something to put it more in line with maybe Social Security or what's been seen in the private sector. More innovative solutions are moving away from a final earnings plan to something closer to a career average. We put out a brief on this at the center, and final earnings plans, in point of fact, treat low earners or disadvantage low earners in comparison to high earners and those with a higher earnings trajectory, as well as encourage things like spiking and end-of-year ballooning of pension salary. Another innovative solution we've considered at the center is having a DC plan stacked on top of a DB plan. Currently, most of the plan design changes you've seen have been hybrids where the system is parallel, where you have a DC and a DB alongside each other. What we're considering at the center is something where it is more of a vertical system. And what you have is a smaller DB pension on a portion of salary that's more in line with the salary of the average taxpayer, we'll say. And any salary above that goes into a DC. In that way, you have the taxpayer is not on the hook for risk for high salaried members of the pension plan. And as well, you still have the ability to cover low earners under the pension system, which is what we believe the true point of the pension system is, to support retirement income for low wage earners and career low wage earners. So what conclusions can we draw? To date, pensions have had a small impact on budgets and borrowing costs, but as David noted and I've shown, costs are increasing and rating agencies are taking note. To keep the impact small, state and local plans should start making reforms. They need to make their arc. Extending the normal retirement age makes sense. And there are other more innovative solutions such as a DB-DC stacked or moving away from final earnings to something more like a career average plan. If any of you have any interest in learning more about what we've done at the center, we have a lot of work. I can't go through it all right now. But here are the links. As well, we have a public pension plans database currently available that has data on the 126 state and local plans that we've collected from 2001 to 2009. I think it's a very useful resource, and I hope everybody gets a chance to look at it. We're also, right now, updating our local data set, which may be more appropriate for the current concerns of this audience. And hopefully we'll have an updated local data set by the end of the summer. That's all.
We asked JP to consolidate about a couple hundred pages of research into a 10-minute talk, and thank you for that overview. It's really not, it's a cruel and unusual punishment for those of us in academia. But also we wanted to sort of start with a global view and then drill down locally, and I can't think of anybody better to help us drill down locally than Jim Del Signore.
Thank you, David, and thanks to the Research Bureau for having me this morning to talk about this subject. I have some pretty busy slides, and I'm going to have to go fairly quickly to get through them in the allotted time, so let's get going. First of all, the Worcester Retirement System was created in 1945, and we started to accrue an unfunded liability from day one. In 1950, Massachusetts opted not to go into the Social Security system. We weren't in it before, we're not in it now. In 1987, the first actuarial valuation was performed, and you can see the statistics. And actually, it turned out that an actuarial funding schedule would be less than pay-as-you-go, which is what we were doing at the time. And then in 1991, legislation was passed allowing funding based on an actuarial funding schedule. In 1997, legislation was passed shifting the cost of COLAs from the state to local systems, greatly increasing our unfunded liability. And then in 1998, legislation was passed allowing the city to issue a pension obligation bond as a means to deal with this increased liability. Then in January of 1999, the Worcester Retirement System received the proceeds, and the interest rate on the bonds was 6.31%. Let's see. Nope, you don't want that. Okay, second page. All right, when we issued the bond, the credit ratings weren't affected. Actually, it was recalibrated to A1. It started at A3, then it went to A1. Debt amortization, $16.6 million a year until 1/1/28. As far as the proceeds, the investment portfolio grew from $312 million to $529 million. We did not dollar cost average. And after a good year in 1999, the portfolio grew to $615 million. And then during the next decade, it dropped to $448 million. Then it grew to $790 million. Then it fell to $478 million. At the end of last year, it was about $684 million. Right now, it's about $700 million. It's increased, but it hasn't exactly been linear. I think if I had a line chart, it would look like it was drawn by Zorro. But a pension obligation bond is deemed successful if the rate of investment return exceeds the interest rate on the bond. Here's the scorecard. The game isn't over until 2028. We're probably in the fourth inning. We're behind right now, but it wouldn't surprise me if we went back into the lead after the end of this year. The things are going pretty good so far this year. Futures are up today, too. Factors contributing to the unfunded liability. When we issued the pension obligation bond, the goal was to fully fund our actuarial accrued unfunded liability. This is data from the actuarial evaluation, which the Retirement Board will be reviewing tomorrow. You're getting a sneak preview today. We have a $300 million unfunded liability with a ratio of 70.7% on an actuarial basis, and $343 million with a 66.5% funded ratio on a market value basis. The difference between the two are deferred investment losses. When we received the proceeds of the pension obligation bond, they were $9 million less than the unfunded actuarial accrued liability at the time. We had the tragic and very expensive for the retirement system fire in 1999. We've had pension increases granted for an organized group of local retirees. We've had several termination allowances during the last decade as people have been terminated. We've had 3 early retirement incentives. Legislation has been passed on a statewide basis, increasing benefits, and we've changed our assumptions. The discount rate has been dropped from 8.5% to 8%, adding about $40 million to liabilities, and the mortality table has been updated, adding about $20 million to liabilities. When we issued the bond, we didn't recognize a liability for payments to other systems for pensions they pay to former city employees. It's a long story, but the bottom line is added about $16 million to liabilities at present. The COLA has been paid at max every year since 1998, and investment returns have been less than the discount rate. As far as funding is concerned, the majority of funding comes from investment income. Employees and employers contribute the rest. The Retirement Board employed asset smoothing for the first time in 2002 over a 3-year period, and that was done to lessen the impact of poor investment returns on the city budget. Smoothing allows you to defer actuarial investment losses. Any investment income below the discount rate is considered an actuarial investment loss, so we deferred some of that. And then we had another bad year, and we extended the smoothing period to 5 years to deal with the further portfolio deterioration. And then over the next 4.5 years, the markets recovered, our patience was rewarded, and it showed that the funding strategy to deal with market volatility was successful. It's not necessarily pay me now or pay me later, especially if the markets cooperate, which they have done for a very long period of time. Then we had the debacle of 2008, and we started to employ, and we're doing it right now, employing a strategy similar to what was done earlier. And we've been assisted by legislation that was passed, extending the funding schedule to 2040. And in fiscal 2011, the legislation allowed the Retirement Board to assess the city and the Housing Authority $4 million less than what would have been the minimum assessment otherwise. Actually, the retirement board had anticipated that this would be passed eventually, and we could have raised the assessment a lot more than we did in 2010. We didn't. We structured something anticipating this, and when it was actually passed, the second year of funding fell right in. We didn't have to do anything. It was already done. And as a result of doing these things, many jobs were saved in the previous decade as well as the last 2 years, and will be in fiscal 2012 using the assessment mitigation tools available to us. As far as the current funding schedule, we reduced the discount rate from 8.25% last year to 8% presently. That's more in line with our peers, and it was encouraged by the state, although the state itself still maintains an 8.25% discount rate. The length of the funding schedule has been shortened from 2040 to 2035 this year. The smoothing corridor has been reduced, and the total assessment is going to be $32.7 million, that it will all be received on July 1st. This is something we've been doing for the last 12 years or so. By virtue of the city paying us on July 1st instead of holding on to the money, if they didn't pay us, they would owe us interest at the discount rate, which is now 8%, which is a lot more than what they could earn on, say, treasury bills, repos, or CDs. So that's why we do that. Another thing is the funding, you can see, went up from last year, but it's still $1.6 million less than what had been the minimum assessment 2 years ago. And we also use this time of year to rebalance where necessary when we get all this money at once. We kind of rebalance during the year, but then we do full rebalancing on July 1st if it's needed. As far as the pension funding breakdown for 2012, it consists of normal costs, which are costs for current employees, $9.4 million. Unfunded actuarial accrued liability amortization, $19.6 million, and the ERI and benefit enhancements, $3.7 million. The costs that you saw a couple of slides ago are kind of divided up between normal cost and the UAAL amortization. And as far as normal costs are concerned, according to the valuation which we'll be reviewing tomorrow, it is only 4.13% for non-public safety employees and 8.27% for public safety employees because of their hazardous jobs, and a lot of those expenses are absorbed by the retirement system. Comparing that with Social Security, employer costs are supposedly 6.2%, but at what discount rate? They don't have an investment portfolio, so I don't think you can accurately say what their true costs are. And I assure you that a lot of us in Social Security would have liked to have stimulated the economy with a 2% reduction in our contributions this year, but we're not going to get that opportunity. And if we did, it would have helped it would have hurt the retirement system. But I guess with Social Security, it doesn't matter all that much. As far as outside influences, it's not uncommon for DB public pension plans to be squeezed at both ends. There are groups constantly looking for benefit increases and others looking for a complete conversion to a defined contribution plan or worse. ERISA, along with subsequent federal legislation, has caused many private businesses to terminate defined benefit plans with overregulation and high administrative costs. You can say that they've been getting squeezed at both ends, and a lot of them have run away from defined benefit plans as a result, and we hope that doesn't happen to us. And currently, there is pressure on public plans to lower their discount rate from an average of 8% to a risk-free amount, 4% perhaps. What this amounts to, in my opinion, is a battle between actuaries and economists. The actuaries, most of them anyway, except for a couple of prominent ones, have suggested an 8% rate is okay, and the risk-free, some of the economists seem to favor that. But it's a common goal of both to inform stakeholders of true costs, so I guess for now they can agree to disagree. I think it's more appropriate for businesses than for public plans because their potential life is shorter. Public plans take a long-term view as their expected life is longer. And one thing I do know for sure is the funding requirement for public plans would go up dramatically if a risk-free discount rate was used. And that would have an adverse effect on credit ratings, and that would have a devastating impact on the city budget. And the GASB has rejected this as a basis of accounting for public plans in the preliminary reviews. I don't always agree with GASB, but this time I most certainly do. As far as legislation, local retirement boards were victimized by heat-of-the-moment legislation. I couldn't let this one go. It was actually talked about in this building. I'm not sure if it was in this room during the gubernatorial campaign of 2006. I've written a couple of op-eds about it. A law was passed requiring local boards to turn over their portfolios to the state if certain benchmarks aren't met. It was said that local plans weren't aggressive enough. I think some people had short memories. Forgot what happened a short time ago. Before that, they say the memory in the investment world tends to be about 3 to 4 years. I think it's about 3 to 4 minutes, maybe 3 to 4 seconds sometimes. And those with less aggressive portfolios that were forced into the state fund in October of 2007 when the market had peaked got whipsawed. And fortunately, the Worcester retirement system was not forced into the state plan, and we've had better returns than the state in each of the last 3 years, and it would have been costly if we were forced in because investment income would have been about $35 million less over that period. There should not be a competition between well-run plans, those who don't want to manage their pension funds and go in. Some of my friends who I saw yesterday at a conference opted to go in. We did not. And actually, the new treasurer agrees that we shouldn't be forced to go into the funds if we don't think it's appropriate. The law requires a 65% funded ratio for local boards as one of the benchmarks that has to be met to avoid going in. That did not change after the 2008 debacle, and it does not address the discount rate or smoothing, which has a major impact on the funding ratio. Some of us in the business might think that whoever wrote this law didn't know what they were doing, but of course I'd never say that. But having said that, several positive changes have been made in pension law that have been implemented recently. They were pointed out in Globe articles. Everyone was familiar with it. Passage was easy. And there's some proposed legislation, which I agree with. I think will save a lot of money, that would increase the retirement age, stop spiking. There's something in there about termination allowances. But one thing I did find bewildering was that the Municipal Relief Act allowed retirement boards with legislative approval to increase the COLA base with no limit. And bills have been filed in the state legislature to raise the base to $16,000 for state retirees. If we did that in Worcester, it would increase our liabilities by about $20 million. Suggested legislation, I think the COLA base should be increased, but increases and the CPI formula should replicate the Social Security system and be uniform statewide. I also think they should think about prorating accidental disabilities. We've had several disabilities that we've granted after a short term of employment, and we've had other people who are deemed 100% disabled for the job they were disabled from, but 100% capable of doing other physical jobs. There are income limits on what some of these people can make after they're retired, but there are clever ways to hide that income, and I think if you did something like this, it would cut down on those abuses. As far as local changes are concerned, accidental disabilities have decreased since the earlier part of the last decade, as you can see from the commentary. But nevertheless, there have been and will continue to be accidental disabilities after short-term employment. More stringent pre-employment physicals should be performed for non-public safety jobs. Jobs involving heavy lifting should require physicals that simulate job conditions. And I think there need to be wellness program improvements. There have been some past successes, but more needs to be done, perhaps with the help of the state legislature. So I think I finished it on time. These are some websites you can go to for further information about the retirement system. I hope the outtake from today, if nothing else, that you can see that the Worcester retirement system is well run and that taxpayers are getting a good value. Thanks.
I feel like I'm in a graduate seminar where I did most of the reading, but not necessarily all of it. But Steve Lasauskas is going to help us sort through an enormous amount of information. Steve does not have a PowerPoint, so we don't have to hit F5. Steve, if you can join us and shed a little light on what you've heard here and what you've seen in some of the other communities you've been in.
Great. Thank you, David, and thank you to Roberta and the Research Bureau for inviting me here today. Just by way of background, I was executive director, as David mentioned, of the Springfield Finance Control Board. Prior to that, had worked on a couple of municipal turnarounds up on the North Shore of Massachusetts, and now with the Collins Center for Public Management at UMass Boston, do consulting to distressed municipalities in other states as well as in Massachusetts. And so when I moved to the town of Andover up on the North Shore where I live now, I went into town hall and apologized to the town manager because every place I go to tends to collapse. Because I also lived in Detroit and a few other places. So, either I follow distress or distress follows me. You can ask my wife as to which one applies, at least for her. So the immediate term question for us is the current pension system sustainable? And I think certainly from my perspective, the answer is a clear no. It's not sustainable. And policy decisions in past generations have confirmed that, have only supported that. We had a period of time where everywhere employees were non-contributory. Everybody put 0% into the pension. It was funded by the taxpayers either on pay-as-you-go or into a trust fund over time. That was increased to create a classification of 5%ers, 7%ers, 9% people. Now people who started the most recently contribute 9% plus 2%. I believe it's above, if it's above $30,000, the 2%, 11% total of that income. So there are prior policy decisions that have been made that sort of leave breadcrumbs for us that say it hasn't been sustainable in the past, and we've done something to address that. So as I look at the situation now, is it sustainable? No. Is it fixable? Yes. And there are two sets of questions as I see them. There's a Massachusetts question and community and states like Massachusetts, and then there are all the other states. If you go down to Rhode Island, for instance, there's the city of Central Falls, which I know a little bit about, 17,000 people there, 3 separate pension funds for that small community, all of which are administered, 2 of which are administered locally, and there's no pension contribution requirement at all. So you have 2 pension funds 0% funded on pay-as-you-go. So one of the things Massachusetts has, some of the finance law reflects the progressive movement from like 1910, 1911, and hasn't been updated. And in the financial crisis, we've seen some wisdom in that. Prior to, many of us in the municipal finance were banging our heads against, why is this so conservative? And then when everything tanked in the world, we realized the wisdom of that deeply conservative approach. But some of the states, I should say, don't have these pension funding requirements, and that was shown in JP's research, where the average contribution was something less than the annual unfunded liability for nationally. So the system isn't sustainable in my mind, but it is indeed fixable because the solutions rest with us. Now, the solutions will be expensive, and they require because I work in distressed communities, what I tend to refer to as adult decisions. Something has to give, and there is a decision that you squeeze out the abuses. We've certainly done that. There are some additional abuses, additional reforms that are potential here, but you have to decide. The money has to come from somewhere. Is it going to come from reduced benefits? Is it going to come from the taxpayers in terms of increased taxes? Is it going to come from reduced services? There's an area where it has to come from, but in Massachusetts anyway, because it has to be funded, and in other communities and other states because it will have to be funded even if it's not required, a decision will have to be made as to how you do it. It's an appropriate decision. It's a necessary decision, assuming you want to keep a public pension system, which is, again, as JP pointed out, you're quite limited in your ability to eliminate or adjust benefits for existing retirees. It is possible in 26 states to do that, but you are extraordinarily limited in your ability to do it, and it takes some substantial difficulty to do that. So acknowledging the Massachusetts bias here, that we have standardized benefits across the state, other states don't have that, Connecticut doesn't have it either, and the fact that we have a funding requirement that others don't, we have the benefit here of our system is more sustainable than some others. It's not. New York has grappled with it. I used to work for New York Common Retirement Fund. New York has grappled with it because they were overfunded. Now we only ever 100% funded, but when I was there, we were 154% funded. So I mean, they were only ever reporting it at full funding. So there are states that do a fantastic job. Massachusetts is closer to that. It does a good job, I would say. And so when you're looking at the liability, when I look at the liability, it's a long-term liability, and we have a period of time that we define. As Jim mentioned, it used to be 2028, and then it can get pushed out to 2040, and then with no doubt with Jim's assistance moved it back to 2035. That there is the ability to affect that deadline, but it's a long-term deadline. And so standing here and saying, oh my goodness, the liability is in Springfield $460 million. What am I going to do? Well, fortunately, you have 20, 30 years to work on that. And I'll talk about how the rating agencies see that, at least in my experience, in just a little bit. So we have a period of time over which we can solve the issue. And for most, it appears to me anyway, you can solve it. There are communities that I've seen that just can't solve it. that their pension contribution is, in one instance, 56% of their operating budget, if they were to make their pension contribution for 1 year, that you could get rid of the community and make it a taxing authority for retirees for the next 15 years, and then you could fund your pension. You would fully fund your pension. So there are communities that are in some substantial difficulty here. And Rhode Island recently changed its actuarially assumed rate of return from 8.5% to 7.25%. And the community that was looking at a 56% of payroll went to 82% of payroll, what they have to contribute for their retirees. So that's obviously a substantially different situation than we're looking at anywhere in Massachusetts. So in my experience, having been before the rating agencies in primarily just probably about half and half distressed communities and not distressed communities, my experience is the market reaction is a reasonable one. That investors and the credit rating agencies are pretty reasonable folks. And taking the Massachusetts bias, because that's where my rating agency experience is do you have a plan to address the liability? And in Massachusetts, again, fortunately we do. We get every community gets its contribution requirement from the state, and the municipality funds that. So if you have a plan, you have these massive liabilities, and the same answer goes with OPEB, other post-employment benefits, is do you have a plan and are you working that plan? And if you are, people tend to be pretty reasonable, and my experience is the market tends to be pretty reasonable. But it first comes down to management willingness. In Massachusetts, that management willingness, again, is a function of state law. You have to make your pension contribution. In other communities and other states, it is truly up to management discretion as to whether you're going to fund that liability. And that's where it comes in. I think that's where the rating agencies will pay particular focus is outside of Massachusetts, because there's not that requirement. They'll come back to Massachusetts when we come to OPEB and say, what are we going to do about this yawning deficit, liability anyway, for folks. So I think there's a different question. There's a Massachusetts question, and then there's a larger national question there. And I think in terms of, I've had some discussions with some folks who work in the market on a daily basis to talk about their reaction to this. And their thinking is a couplefold. Number one, the market is beginning to be conditioned to increase disclosure requirements. So now municipalities are disclosing their unfunded pension liabilities. They've been doing that for a while. Unfunded OPEB liabilities, and the rating agencies will eventually get around to focusing putting additional scrutiny on potentially on capital liabilities as well. So some of the three big liabilities that are out there. So people are asking more, and there will be market discipline applied to the communities and the states that are not disclosing in a timely and appropriate manner. And then you're also likely to see, as people continue to focus on these liability issues, more weak credits. And as you have more weak credits, it's likely to be the pain felt on the yield curve for those weaker credits could be more severe, because you're looking at some folks, some communities who have some really substantial pension liabilities, in some instances, as I indicated, 100%. And that because that's such a difficult hole to dig out of, you'll see, you actually have seen some communities drop 5 or 6 notches on a rating all at once, and lose market access completely, which can obviously cause some substantial difficulty. So my experience with the market on this is they're generally pretty reasonable. I think they understand too. Does management have a plan, and are they working that plan? And what are we doing to address the sustainability issue, whether that's the plan or whether that's making some other prudent adjustments over time? So it's a huge liability. In my experience, it's a massive issue. It can be managed, and it can be made more sustainable. We've done it in the past, in generations past, and most recently, but we're likely to continue to need to do it. But hopefully, cool heads can prevail in these discussions, and we can make something that continues to work for municipalities and for the retirees, because it's important for both. So with that, I'll hand it back over to David. Thank you.
We have, by my count, about 20 minutes. I'm under strict orders to wrap up the formal portion of this at 9:15. And so while I have dozens of questions, I really want to make sure that those of you who've taken time out of your busy schedules get some of your questions answered. I'm going to apply, even though we're in Worcester, Kennedy School rules. which really are two. One is I'd ask you to identify yourself, and the second is that a question is a short request for information, not a speech stating opinion. And again, given the time, I'd ask you to keep things relatively short. There is a mic here, and you should know that when you ask that question, you're going to wind up on the videotape and be part of JP, the movies that JP is going to be making something like that. So there's one way in the back, I believe.
Yes, good morning. I'm Karen Polito, and thank you for your observations and sharing so much this morning. It appears that there is some consensus that pension plans on the public side are unsustainable, particularly here in Massachusetts. We have some real challenges. I was interested in learning a little bit more about Jean's recommendation for stacking a plan, and whether or not you can point to a particular state that has moved in that direction, and how would that be implemented in a state like Massachusetts where we have a Social Security system? That may not be answerable in one sentence, but just a general comment there, and thank you.
Right. That's a great question. We haven't worked out clearly all the specific details of legislation that would be behind this type of plan. However, the concept goes something like this. The DB portion of the benefit would only be based on earnings up to something like the median taxpayer's salary. Any earnings that the state employee or government employee earns above that would go into a defined contribution plan. The reasoning being that the taxpayer who's making, we'll say $50,000, has no more of a capability to bear the risk of a government employee making $100,000, the pension behind that, than the actual employee does. And so what you would get would be that the taxpayer would bear the risk of a salary within his range, essentially. And any risk above that is something that the pensioner can bear on his own, would be the idea. And so where you set that limit, the pensionable earnings, that's up to legislatures in each locality or state to decide. But the idea would be that really high earners can bear the risk of investments and the markets on their own, and that the taxpayer who's maybe making less than that should not be forced to bear that risk. But anything further as far as the details hasn't quite been fleshed out. We do have an issue brief online if you go to our website that has that fully fleshes out the idea a little more.
Good morning, Michael O'Brien, City Manager. Question for Jim Del Signore, putting him on a hot seat. Nice to reverse the role a little bit. Jim, the total amount of both retiree pension obligation as well as OPEB obligation combined, present value and or pay as you go, and then the realities of what your assumptions are within your retirement system for wage increases year to year, and how does, for instance, the recent settlement I have with 3 back-to-back zeros with 504 affect that calculation for retirement, as well as the healthcare reforms that we put in place, and how does that affect that overall liability?
Well, I don't have to say through the chair when I answer. I'm not a counselor. But anyway, as far as the health care, it has a major impact on OPEB. Nothing on the retirement system, two separate things. Yes, we did have a salary experience gain by virtue of having zeros and having a higher assumed salary increase. We did reduce that with the last valuation from a 5% inflation rate down to 4 3/4. There are some increases, as you know, because of step increases, but we did get a large experience gain last year, and that was one of the reasons we were able to lower the discount rate from 8 1/4% to 8%.
Randy Ormo from Worcester. From what I can understand, compensation for public employees today is under fire from some parts of our society, both pensions and what they're being paid for pay. the decision to go into pensions versus using Social Security, as you mentioned, the city of Worcester made that option. How does the payout for pensions compare with what Social Security pays out, one to one against each other? And is the choice that was made earlier to go with pensions the best choice, or is it maybe we should maybe go back to the square one and say maybe we should go back, if it's at all possible, to going to Social Security and look at other ways to add incentives to employees for public employees?
I'll actually take a first shot and then hand the microphone around. So I would just note that, so for instance, in particular states, and I'm not going to name the state for confidentiality reasons, but in this one particular municipality in this particular state, and it's a small municipality, pensions, if you were to eliminate all pension income above the average retirement income of retirees in that state. So you take all retirees, public and private, get to their baseline pension, Social Security income, and private pensions, and were to adjust all public pensions to that level, you'd see about a 30% drop in public pensions in that state. Now, that is a state that doesn't have regulation to its pension system in the same way Massachusetts does. So there was, on that plan, there was one employee who worked 1 year. The mayor gave him 20 years of credit, and then he retired with 21 years of service. And it's also a state where there's no minimum retirement age, so there are 38-year-olds who are getting pensions for 50, 60 years, depending on how long they live. So I think that's an outlier. That's not necessarily consistent. So I can't answer from a broad-based research. I can only answer it based upon this particular state. But I would say they may be higher, they may be lower in certain cases, because there are a whole lot of retirees on that pension plan who are making, maybe $6,000 a year as a pension. So I think there's a lot of variability in it in this particular instance, and it may be the experience of that community because of the abuses, that there are some particular variances that throw the numbers off.
Yeah. I see this question coming from two sides. There's the first part, which is what you said. How do the benefits compare? So how do the retirees fare? In that case, from our research, it looks, at least at the state plan in aggregate, I would say the softly parity. We found actually in Massachusetts, when I worked in the Pension Commission for Reform, that Massachusetts employees' benefits were not all that exorbitant when compared to other states, especially because of the fact that they were not getting Social Security. But I can't make any claims to sort of, each individual state. But in aggregate, it seems like parity. The second part is is the question of how do state finances get changed? How do pension contributions change? How do overall retirement costs change for a state if they're to join Social Security? The issue there is that there's a large legacy cost of Social Security right now that is built into the contribution rate. And so for a state that hasn't participated in Social Security up until now, they'd be bearing a cost for something that they never built. And so in that sense, it doesn't make any sense financially for a state to join Social Security because of the legacy costs they'd be paying for that they didn't accumulate.
This is actually one of the rare cases where I think I actually know something, or more than the panelists. Josh Rao, who is the Northwestern University economist who sort of has been leading the charge on this fairly interesting question about what the discount rate is, when he spoke at the Kennedy School about a month ago, said in his estimates, given some of these issues and given the fact that Massachusetts has for 20 years been at least working to plow at the unfunded liability, he believed that this was switching to Social Security would be one of the few states actually where it probably didn't make sense, and that was echoed. Greg Menis, who's the Assistant Secretary for Finance at ANF, concurred with that assessment. So I think that's actually been a pretty consistent message that the Social Security, switching over at least to a Social Security piece had no great benefit for the state. And I think as JP's pointed out, Social Security is, for most people in the system, a defined benefit. So that at least provides a floor for folks. And any switch to a defined contribution system really needs to take into account that is the pension is the only source of retirement income for public sector workers in the state. So that's actually what I think makes the proposal you're working on such an interesting idea, at least here. Other questions?
Connie Lukes, I'm the city councilor in Worcester. When many of you spoke about what works for municipalities, our city auditor has been very vocal about maintaining the Worcester retirement system as separate and not being absorbed by the state. He quoted the employer costs for public safety being twice as that for non-public safety. Now, we had over 100 pension systems in the Commonwealth. I'm just wondering, from what works for a city, whether it's better to have the separate entities, for example, even carving out, and I don't know if you'd agree that it would be a good or bad thing, carving out public safety employees as having their own pension system because of the unique situation they are in compared to other public employees. Bottom line, the question is, what works better for cities? Having one system operated by the state, or having different systems that meet the needs of the local communities?
Well, as I indicated in my remarks, I work for New York Common, which is a state fund for all governments in New York State. So it's a state and municipal program all together. And so when I moved back to Massachusetts, I was much more aware of the pension issues and realized, hey, we operate it differently. As part of the restructuring of the city of Springfield, we folded the city's retirement system into the state's retirement system and saw first year $25 million in increased investment earnings based on, now how do you establish that, sort of based on prior trends in earnings for the city's plan. So we saw a very substantial growth. And I actually have a file that I keep of every pension system's return relative to the state going back to when they started back 15, 20 years, I think it is. And there's only, and it's been reported, I think 6 pension systems that over an extended period of time have exceeded the performance of the state. So right now, the legislature has made various policy decisions and said you can remain as a local pension system if you meet certain qualifications. And so I'm not going to question that. I will tell you my experience is in New York. It worked extraordinarily well to have them all folded in, that all pension systems gained the benefit, large and small, gained the benefit of the buying power, the professional management and oversight, and a whole host of other benefits of a state program. That you weren't investing $30 million, you were a part of $120 billion. And that's a much different playing field that you're in. You're much less likely to get taken advantage of by the people who are selling investments. That being said, Worcester is not a $30 million plan. And so there are differences, and the legislature has opined as it is opined. My experience is there are huge benefits to being part of a central plan, but Worcester there are outliers that argue separately, that argue for different treatment, and Worcester may very well be one because of its size and because of its presumed professional management.
Well, I mentioned in my slide that the legislation was passed in 2007. And so and then as of October 1st, that's when systems were forced in, either voluntarily or they were gone in on their own. And as you might remember, the market peaked in 2007 in October. And as I said in the slide, a lot of those funds got whipsawed. They also had the state, when they take you over, don't take your private equity funds. So it means you're over allocated to that asset class. Your asset allocation is out of whack. And that's what's happened to a lot of these funds that have been absorbed. And as I said, over the last 3 years, our investment income would have been $35 million less. As I said in the commentary that I didn't mention this morning, the state was outperforming a lot of funds because they had a nice run with an exposure to emerging markets and large buyout funds that a lot of us didn't. We used to be in emerging markets back in the 90s, did very well, and then they really tanked for several years. And the state's consultant, to his credit, advised them to get back in at a very good time, and as a result, their returns were up. And then by comparison, when you compare those 6 really good years in a row they had
their long-term results were better than a lot of the local boards. But that trend is not won't continue and hasn't continued. As I said earlier, there are some funds that went in voluntarily. Nothing against my friends that I saw at this conference yesterday that are finance people on retirement boards. They don't really know much about this stuff, and they really don't care about it. And you might be able to tell I'm pretty deeply involved with this. So there are differences on the boards, and so not all cases are the same.
JP, I want to turn the question just slightly sideways. In the research you've done, as you've looked across states, is there any evidence one way or the other that the unified systems do any particularly better or worse? I mean, I can actually make both. One argument saying there's sort of an interesting competition that we've set up in Massachusetts. Steve sort of sets up a kind of efficiency argument. I have no idea what the data might say on that.
Well, the issue too is that the sample size of states that have sort of disparate local plans is pretty small. So you have Pennsylvania, Florida, and Massachusetts are the three I know off the top of my head. And there may be some others. Others are like New York State and Local and CalPERS, which is sort of an amalgamation of a bunch of small plans for investment purposes. But yeah, we haven't done any specific research on that. But if you look at those plans like CalPERS and New York State, they fare just as well as any of the other plans that are more sort of a single employer type plan, or not an amalgamation of localities. As far as looking at the myriad small plans in Massachusetts and Pennsylvania and Florida, we haven't quite gotten there yet.
I think I saw Nick Favorito had his hand up, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this. You can tell us who you are and then the question or comment that you've got.
Thank you, David. Nick Favorito from the State Retirement Board. I would just note for the record that in my shop we do the benefit side of the house, so we're not doing the investment side of the house, which is maintained by Prim. But I'm going to beg indulgence, David, on your rules, just for point of clarification.
You get the clue. You get a waiver.
In terms of the counselor's question, in terms of consolidating, I want to make sure that that she's clear that the legislation that Jim is talked about investment, consolidating, taking over the investments by Prim, and the local boards still maintaining the benefit side. So all the systems still do their own benefits administration, insofar as we're aware. The Turnpike's retirement system is the only one in the last couple of years which was abolished totally and was given to us. By way on the Social Security question, if I could, in 51, it seems when the Commonwealth decided not to join the the Social Security system, I can't claim that I was around in 51 when the decision was made, but my sense is that part of the rationale had to be that systems that existed, the state system and the teacher system had been around since at least 1911, 1912. Worcester, for example, 1945. So I have to surmise that part of the rationale was the Commonwealth had systems already in place that were performing, at least at the time, based on the conceptions at the time, appropriately to provide benefits. Now, this was pay-as-you-go at the time, and so history has proven us that isn't necessarily the way. So I believe that from my research, that was part of the rationale why we didn't join at the time. The other piece that I would add to that discussion, if there was a total switch over to Social Security, would be the payroll costs that would be involved in terms of employer costs and the employee deductions that would have to be made, the FICA costs that would have to be made by the employers and the employees going forward, 6.25%, if I'm correct, if I remember correctly, while also having to deal with whatever unfunded liability the system has at that point from the past. So it seems to me, I don't have the numbers, but there is an additional cost associated with switching to Social Security if the decision was made to go forward with that. I don't know what the impact would be from for example, on the Worcester level, what the city pays from a percentage of payroll to the retirement system versus what it would pay at 6.25% to the federal government on top of trying to resolve its unfunded liability. So I would just point out those two other areas. And I think the Social Security issue is a legitimate one that people should, if they're like me and they believe in the purpose of a defined benefit plan, to remind people that the Commonwealth doesn't have that benefit. So we are we are the people's, the employees' retirement plan. This is what they get. And at the end of the day, we're in a retail business, and while everybody here makes valid points in terms of, and this is the kind of the debate that we should be encouraging in terms of trying to change the current benefit structure, because it does need to be updated and changed. But at the end of the day, we're in a retail business, and I see the people coming into my office on a day-to-day basis who go to retire, and we've done surveys of our members in terms of what they think they should have by way of savings to retire, and they're all over the map in terms of not understanding how much they should have. If you take away Social Security, and this is the only plan that they have, this discussion is helpful, but we need to remember that this is going to be their livelihood for some number of years after they stop working.
So by my count, we've hit the witching hour. I want to one more question.
I'm Fred Mulligan from Worcester, and the question I have is, what are the big impediments to addressing this thoughtfully?
How long do you have? Good. Just go right down the line, I think, on this one.
All right. An impediment that we've found is just simply the data. For the work that we do at the center, getting data on the universe of plans out there is extremely difficult. I mean, I still have to call up every state and every plan and talk to Sally or Jim at the front desk and get through that wall every time. And it took 3 years to get these connections in order to get these reports. And even when I get them, they're a piece of paper like this that I have to transfer into some kind of usable format for any kind of analysis. So just getting the numbers out there is very challenging, and it's hard to make any useful decisions without the numbers. And so that's one of the first impediments. That's what we're trying to alleviate with our data set, is that not only researchers but practitioners can go there and make comparisons between their state and others in benefits, in normal cost and those kind of formulas and investments, and really get a sense of what the universe looks like of plans.
And I think, from my perspective, it's a couple of things. One, as the prior speaker, commenter indicated, you're dealing with some very serious issues for some people. Their retirement income, what they're going to be able to afford when they do retire. So it gets emotional, and it gets passionate, and it gets personal very quickly. So that's my first reaction to it is it's hard to have this kind of discussion when you start getting a lot of stakeholders. I'm a stakeholder, I'm in the public pension system, but it's a little ways away yet. So I think it gets personal pretty quickly, and so that sort of puts a limit on it.
I agree with both of you. I agree with there should be standardization in financial reports. Everyone should report at market value so you don't have this confusion with actuarial. Discount rates should be regulated. And there's a lot of emotion involved, no doubt. Actually, I took a course one time in behavioral finance at Harvard, and they would tell you before you did it not to do this. And this whole class of intelligent people from all over the country would still do it. And it's just amazing sometimes the psychology that people have with investing and something as complicated as a retirement system. So it's no easy fix. I think the system works pretty well now. I think people need patience. Yeah, Social Security really isn't an option for us. I agree with that too. 6.2% normal cost for the employee and the employer is just prohibitive. We've been doing this for 100 years now, and we should continue. It needs to be tweaked. I've seen the governor's proposed legislation. I think there's a lot of cost savers in there, and just move on. The markets, the Standard & Poor's since 1926 has averaged 10% a year. So as I said earlier, investment income provides most of the funding for DB plans. Social Security, unfortunately, doesn't invest anything. So just let it work. The last decade we've had has been the worst decade since 1926, since the Depression. So maybe that's not going to happen in the future. When we issued the pension obligation bond, we did it over a 29-year period to go through several market cycles. Didn't start off too good. It's a good thing we didn't do over 10 years because we would have lost. But I'm pretty confident over a 29-year period we'll be ahead of the 6.31% rate on the bond. So as I said, it's not an easy issue. And people can continue to agree to not agree, and that will continue to happen.
Let me just want to highlight three points that really strike me in this conversation. I think the first is Massachusetts actually is nowhere near as bad off as many other states, and that really is the result of a series of people, making tough. Steve didn't quite say it this way. They're not perfect decisions, but this actually really is a case of some folks grappling and at least beginning to make some important progress on some really difficult issues. And so we should always recognize that as we read some of the national debates. And we certainly beat ourselves up enough. We ought to occasionally take credit for doing something right. Having said that, this is still a really big issue. And it's one, I really like Steve's point, that it's one that's going to require adult conversations and adult decisions, and it's an extremely complicated issue. As folks have pointed out, it really involves expectations that people have and promises that were made. It's complicated by a decision, right or wrong, made in the 50s about Social Security. And I want to underscore that there's really two issues going on here. One is, what do we do about the cost of promises we made? And then the other is, how do we make sure that the hole's not getting any deeper in Massachusetts for sort of current employees and current systems? And then the last takeaway, those of us who studied political science, there's a class of problems in which you have intensely motivated, relatively narrow interests. Now, the universe of retirees is not completely a narrow interest, but it is, a smaller group of people who have intense stakes in this decision, where the costs, are, in a sense, getting the benefits, but the costs are borne at some level by all of us as a whole. And as I indicated when I started, most of us don't spend most of our time walking around thinking about pensions. The danger in situations like that, and we've certainly seen this in Massachusetts, is that people, the intensely motivated narrow interests, game the system and start to do things that you don't like. And we certainly have seen that in the pension system, and we've certainly seen efforts to respond to that in the state over the last few years in several recent pension reform bills. But the price of kind of going forward with this system, going back to Steve's point, is that it's going to require a much broader group of people to continue to pay some attention to this issue, to have the adult conversations, which will include disagreements, and in the end, as we have to do in many things, make some really hard choices. And to that end, I really want to thank all three panelists for both giving us, I think, a sober but also sobering overview of an important issue. I hope you'll join me in thanking them for what I think has been a terrific discussion.